Welcome to the symposium called The Time for Reckoning, Confronting Systemic Racism, Seeking Justice, and Reimagining Society. My name is Paul Grondahl. I'm the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University of Albany. Before I introduce our guest, former colleague of mine at UAlbany and a good friend, Dr. Derik Smith, I want to mention that we are co-sponsoring this event with Alice Green, the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, with other community partners, including WMHT, WAMC, the Times Union, and other groups, Youth FX, All of Us. We see this as an opportunity to engage the community in this dialogue. The issue of systemic racism certainly reaches into all facets of society, and we're very honored today for Dr. Derik Smith to join us. He is Associate Professor of Literature at Claremont McKenna College in California. He's also the newly named chair of the Africana Studies Department. He's widely published and most recently has published a book on the poet Robert Hayden. So welcome, Derik.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to join you there in this endeavor that I think is really well-intentioned, well-planned, and timely. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you here for a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks for being part of it. Now, as I said, you were at UAlbany for several years on the English faculty, and we did programs together in the Writers Institute. And sort of the driving force of this is Alice Green, somebody that you've known, that I've known for 40 years. She's been on the front lines of this campaign effort, lifelong commitment to fighting racial inequality. And in particular, the prisons. She's done a lot of work in prison issues, and her Center for Law and Justice assists and helps inmates who are coming back in, helping them reacclimate and get back into the Albany community. So the event that you and I did was tremendous. Pulitzer Prize winning poet Tahimba Jess, we had him down at Coxsackie Prison. And you've worked many years when you were here in Albany with prisoners and literature programs. And I know you've done it in other states, and I believe you're doing it in California now. So talk about prison issues, in particular, the disproportionate number of people of color and particular Black men in our prisons. How long has that issue been something that you've been involved with?
Well, I got involved in prison education when I was at Albany, and I was there for, I've been doing that now for about, I think 8 years. And it really struck me when I was teaching on the college campus that part of my sort of impulse as a scholar and as a teacher was to somehow engage with what I saw as the exigencies of our historical moment, particularly as they intersected with issues of race, right? And as I was doing that in my sort of traditional classroom on college campuses, I thought that there was a possibility for me to be more deeply engaged and perhaps more meaningfully involved in what I sort of thought of as, the struggle for racial justice. And so I sought out the opportunities to teach in the New York State prison system. And I was very fortunate to be able to form partnership with the Barred Prison Initiative and work in several prisons through that really well-established prison education program. And then later on, the Hudson Link for Prison Education, primarily at the Green Correctional Facility in Coxsackie. And so, I learned a great deal doing that. And I was able to bring the ideas and the teaching that I specialized in, which was in African American literature, to a set of very eager students who were incarcerated in the New York State prison system. And I've continued to do that here in California since I've been out here, and really feel sort of really grateful and fortunate to be able to do that, because it's some of the most exciting and meaningful and intellectually stimulating work that I get to do. So this is, I think, really part of my sort of primary sort of thinking these days in terms of pedagogy and so forth. So yeah, I was just really fortunate to be able to do that in this particular moment. Right now, we're sort of pioneering a perhaps kind of first of its kind video conferencing set of classes here that links up the Claremont colleges with a local California prison. And so we're doing virtual classes with incarcerated students, and that we're starting in about 2 or 3 days. So I'm really excited about doing that as well.
That's great. Congratulations on that work. I still remember driving back with you and Tahimba. He's given a lot of presentations, but he said that was one of the most moving and important to him as well. Why do you think prisoners are so receptive to learning and this opportunity? And to be honest, you've been on a college campus a long time. I have too. Sometimes the students on college campuses are not as receptive or in tune. I mean, he had that group of inmates. You could hear a pin drop. There was so much engagement, and they were sharing stories. He was talking about his book of poems on Leadbelly. Leadbelly also did some prison time, but what is it you think about prisoners that make great students?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that great students are curious, right? Great students are trying to figure out their world in really sort of sincere and focused ways. And it seems to me that those of us who are sort of most curious about our world are often people who feel dislocated in the world, somehow alienated from it. Things don't seem quite right to us, right? And of course, if you're somebody who is sort of dealing with the incredibly difficult conditions of incarceration and recognizing that you are not at all in alignment with the sort of social context, the greater social context in which you've grown up, in which you've been acculturated, then I think that you become very curious about what is it that has led to this kind of feeling of alienation, this dislocation, which is kind of so materially felt for incarcerated students. And then you begin to want to discover as much as you can about that world. And so I feel that for those people who are locked up and who have that curiosity, there's an intensity of feeling, like an intensity of interest in understanding the world once it is sparked. And then when people are able to sort of cultivate and inspire and accompany incarcerated students, they become even more, I think, sort of thankful and engaged with these interlocutors, with these people who are sort of bringing something from this outside world into the prison space. And so my feeling has always been that because of this kind of intense feeling of curiosity that is, again, kind of like provoked by dislocation, a lot of the students inside end up being some of the best and most intellectually sort of provocative and sort of pioneering thinkers, if you will. So that's been my experience, throughout my time teaching with in the prisons.
But the sad irony is that so many of these educational opportunities and classes have been cut in the prison budget. It just seems counterintuitive, or it undercuts their role, by limiting the access to, college career paths and things. So that's what you're trying to address in California. You found that in New York, right? Weren't they constantly cutting back on opportunities for curriculum and learning?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And and this kind of stems from the back to the 1990s, when there was a real sort of effort to um, sort of make the criminalized class shoulder so much of like the cultural burden. Like everything that was wrong with society could be sort of kind of put on the backs of this sort of criminalized underclass, so to speak, right? And so then we would lock up people who came from the most dispossessed, the most abandoned communities and say, here's the problems. Yeah, we can locate all the problems of our society, you know, in this space. And then what should we do with those problematic elements of our society? We should make sure that they are, you know, sort of fully punished, right? Punished in the most harsh terms. And so anything that was seen as a kind of a service to these folk or a kind of a benefit to them, something that would maybe be to their advantage, was stripped away. And of course, education was one of those things. And as people on the outside also kind of struggled to get access to good higher education, there was a feeling of animosity toward someone who was incarcerated and who was the supposed sort of source of so much of our cultural social problems. There was animosity towards those who would be receiving an education inside, right? So that so much of that was stripped away. And then I would say over the past few years, in the past 5 years or so, we've seen a kind of growing recognition, of the need to really address the problems of incarceration and the way that our society has been so dependent on it. And then some of the funding has been sort of reinstituted. And there's, thankfully, I would say there are more and more opportunities for people who are incarcerated to get education. And there's a reinstatement of certain kinds of funding mechanisms which are making these things more available. There's so much efficacy to education in terms of its reduction of recidivism and that kind of thing. So, just on those terms, thankfully, I think we're headed in a better direction than when we were in years past.
I still remember Tahima Jeff's kind of the main point he wanted to make is read everything you get a chance to in prison, take any class that's offered, because education, and reading great literature like frees your mind. Even though you're incarcerated, eventually you'll be released, and this will all help build, the next chapter of your life after incarceration. But let's get back to the prison system. I mean, it's clearly racist, right? You look at the numbers. Is it possible that only Black people are committing crimes? When you go to the prison like we did at Coxsackie, that room of 100 inmates were almost all Black and Latino. And I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know it's much disproportionate to the percentage of Black and Latino members in New York State. So is it a racist system to begin with?
Oh, surely. I mean, so I think that we have to think about it sort of in broad terms, right? I mean, I would argue that sort of all of Western modernity, right, is kind of racist, right? I mean, there's racial structuring to, the modern world, right? And particularly, of course, for American society, which is so deeply embedded, of course, in the history of slavery and the attendant sort of anti-Black racism that was used to justify that sort of economic system. And so then that, of course, has just filtered down through the decades and centuries. And now we have a kind of manifestation of let's say, kind of anti-Blackness and white supremacy and a form of internal xenophobia against certain stigmatized classes, which then gets played out through the institutions of justice, right? Sort of like the policing system and the systems of incarceration. I would also say, though, that there's a kind of an economic driver to all this as well, right? I mean, we know that in the kind of deindustrializing moment of the 1980s and 90s, that there was a dearth of economic opportunity for people in urban spaces, and then that leads to kind of social unrest, social discontent. What do you do with those people? Oh, well, what we can do in a place like New York is take people from the urban centers, Black and Latino people from the urban centers, and then ship them out to upstate, right, where we have another kind of post-industrial economy in which industries that supported these rural towns in the let's say 50s through the 70s are all dissipating, and now we have prisons sort of as the new kind of industry, right? So that was always a kind of fascinating element to me, to go into these upstate prisons and see that it was almost as though, to put it in very crude and harsh terms, there was a crop of imprisoned people that was harvested from the places like New York City, Schenectady and Albany and Rochester and Syracuse and Buffalo, and then shipped out to all these rural spaces where they were like the crop that was being tended to and supplying the sort of economic needs of these rural places. So yes, on the one hand, I see it as this kind of perpetuation of this racial history, this racist history that we have in the U.S., but then also that kind of is imbricated with, woven together with sort of economic realities of the post-industrial moment in America.
Thank you for that, Derik. I also want to talk about, because he's a friend of yours and a former Albany professor, Ibram X. Kendi. This is his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is now getting a second burst of bestsellerdom. But you worked with him when he had just done his first book, Stand from the Beginning, and brought him into the prison. Can you talk about working with Ibram X. Kendi when you were both Albany faculty?
Yeah, so when I was at Albany and Kendi was as well, we had the opportunity to cross paths on a couple of occasions. And then after he left the university, he was interested in sort of promoting his book in the Albany area, and he contacted me to sort of set up some engagements. And after reading the book, I was so impressed with it that I was really, this was sort of before he had become a kind of well-known scholarly figure. I really wanted the opportunity, I really wanted to have the students that I worked with at Green Correctional Facility to have the opportunity to talk with him about his really, I think, important work that he did in Stand from the Beginning, the definitive history of racism in America. And so he spent the day with me and really was gracious in his visiting one of New York State's prisons, and it's I think telling that he is now so one of the foremost sort of figures in this kind of anti-racism discourse, because the way that he understands it is as a kind of manifestation of a long history, right? Contemporary racism as a manifestation and sort of deeply rooted in this long history. And so he's able to offer up a kind of analysis that I think is quite powerful in our moment, because he's so well versed in the development and the evolution of racist ideas and thinking in the West and in America particularly. And so when he came to the prison, that my students didn't have a long time to read his big book. His first book is really quite long, I think almost 500 pages, but many of them were really they did their best to read through it in a few weeks, and some of them actually completed this huge tome in a couple weeks of reading. And they were eager to hear what he had to say. Of course, as we talked about before, they were just grateful to have the opportunity to converse with someone who was helping to explain to them some of the history that led to the conditions that, they were encountering and enduring as they were incarcerated. So it was a great pleasure to work with him in that small endeavor. Yeah.
Right. I want to read kind of the end of his introduction and get your reaction to it, because I like how, this book really tells his own story and looks inward, and he doesn't let himself off the hook either. And I'll just read a little bit of it and then kind of have you react to it. This is Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I used to be racist most of the time. I am changing. I am no longer identifying with racism by claiming to be, quote, not racist. I am no longer speaking through the mask of racial neutrality. I am no longer manipulated by racist ideas to see racial groups as problems. I no longer believe a Black person cannot be racist. I am no longer policing my every action around an imagined white or Black judge, trying to convince white people of my equal humanity, trying to convince Black people I am representing the race well. How do you respond to that? Do you relate to that at all? Do you see that at all in your own life and experience?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that that sort of strike me in the approach that Ibram takes in that book, right? One is, I think, a very powerful one and an important one is that it is racist thinking is inescapable, right? I mean, it can't be sort of evaded. It can only be sort of addressed squarely, right? Because if you attempt to evade racism by saying, I'm not racist or not thinking about it or sort of acting in a way that disregards the power of this construct, the construct of race, then the only thing that you're going to end up doing is perpetuating it, right? Because our social structures are so deeply informed by racial thinking that to not acknowledge that and then work against that is actually simply to perpetuate the kind of, sort of like the racist thought that we that we are all acculturated into in America, right? And so there is this sort of the construction of race as race is the lie, right? Oneness is the truth, right? We are all actually truly human beings, separated by sort of superficial distinctions in culture and perhaps physiology, right? Now so that's the truth, that we are all human beings, right? And the lie is that this thing which has been constructed, race, is actually meaningful in its differentiation of who we are as human beings. And that is not to say that race is not deeply important, right? It is deeply important, but unless we are able to sort of acknowledge that it is constructed and that one race is not superior or inferior to another race, or one culture is not superior or inferior to another culture, right? Unless we can do that, then we're always going to be sort of locked into this sort of lie of race, the racial thinking. And so in the West, right, and now in the kind of Western modernity, which has been exported globally, what we find is that anti-Blackness, right, stigmas that are attached to the category of the racial category of Blackness are inherited by all of us, right? So when Ibram says that, I was no longer going to abide by racist thinking, my understanding is that what he's saying is that he was no longer going to try to work within this system that would label Blackness as being worthy of stigma, right? And so that for Black people, we ourselves, we also have to sort of get rid of that kind of thinking and not sort of be bent on sort of demonstrating that we are worthy, right, or something like that. And of course, because it has such a kind of cultural inertia behind it, that racial thinking is very difficult to escape. It's not easy to sort of get out of those modes of acting and thinking that would sort of validate racial thought. I mean, it's
Right.
some would say it's impossible, but I think what Ibram is asking us to do is to foreground it, to put it at the center of our thought so that perhaps we can move past it or beyond it.
I remember when Barack Obama first became a presidential candidate, people were talking about maybe this is the time for a post-racial society. Well, obviously that was kind of wishful thinking, but I want to talk a moment about we played basketball together. I enjoyed when you joined this pickup game we've had going for a while in Albany. And I wonder, it felt to me, maybe again, wishful thinking, but for at least a moment, for those couple hours, race somewhat disappeared because we had, I mean, I know the stories of a lot of the people there. We had Muslims and Jews. We had white and black. We had Yemen. We had Sudanese. We had Hispanic. And you know, you just sort of randomly pick up teams, and there's a great mixing of many stories and backgrounds and race and ethnic group. And for that couple hours, you know, we were all just trying to make the good pass, hit the shot, you know, go to the basket, share the ball. I don't know. Sports seems like one realm where it's possible, at least for a little while, to get beyond race. What do you think of that? Am I off base on that?
Well, I would say that, we're never, we never get beyond race, even in those kinds of moments where, let's say, the dictates of racial thinking are sidelined, right? Or are play a less of a role. Because what happens, I think, when you're involved in sport, right, is that it is the sort of the structure, the rules of that game, and one's ability to sort of excel or manipulate the structure and the rules of the game that determine one's value. You know what I mean? So it's as though like there's a new kind of apparatus of judgment in operation, and that's one of the things that I always did like about sort of playing basketball in particular is that, when you had these diverse groups of people, it didn't really matter what your title was, what your financial background was. All that was put to the side, and your worth was determined on how well you could play this game, right? And so it was this kind of like this strange kind of sort of equalizing force that would hold forth in these in pickup basketball, for example, right, when you have diverse groups of people playing together. Yet I would still say that sort of within that kind of whole kind of alternative reality, that it's very easy to sort of slip out of that back into, sort of like our racial realities, right? So one person can say one thing, and then all of that sort of falls to the wayside, and then we find ourselves back in the so like the harsh reality of race in the modern world. And I've seen that happen so many times, growing up playing basketball, and continuing to do that even now. So it is fascinating to kind of think about how those rules sort of change within sport. And it's also been fascinating. I don't know if you've been watching this kind of like rebooting of the National Basketball Association.
Oh yeah,
in the bubble era, right? And
yeah,
the way that now kind of like race is being foregrounded in certain ways.
They all have,
right?
Black Lives Matter shirts. They have sayings on the back of their jerseys. It's constantly out front,
Right. Yet at the same time, I mean, it's kind of like a really fascinating thing, right? Because although it's being foregrounded in a way that seems only sort of right, you know what I mean? Like you've got this league that is sort of totally dependent on sort of, Black labor essentially. And for so long, there's this effort to kind of like, and in all sort of American sports, to kind of like disentangle that Black labor from the Black reality or the racial reality that these leagues exist within. But now that's being like foregrounded by the NBA in a way that I really appreciate. Yet at the same time, it's so fascinating, like, for example, commentators, they still can't really talk about the fact that, I don't know if you've been watching, but, what's his name? Luka
hit that
Doncic,
3-point shot,
right? And here's like maybe like the best white player of his generation or of many years,
right,
but sort of his whiteness kind of like is a reality, is an anomaly, right? That kind of like everyone knows, but we don't know really how to talk about it.
Right. But it's also, when you look, I think there are 2 Black coaches now, but when you look at the next level beyond player, coaches, general managers, owners, they're not proportionate. I mean, and I still remember the NFL. You're younger than me, but there were no black quarterbacks. And I think that was clearly a racist, you would not put them in that position until, I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan, Russell Wilson, we got a great quarterback, but there's other, in the recent era, a lot of great black quarterbacks. But would you agree with that was obviously some kind of racist move, that they would not put a black person in that quarterback position for decades?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that, I have sort of steadily sort of grown away from the NFL for a whole bunch of reasons after, spending a lot of time as a kid, watching it. But that sort of, what I perceive to be as very sort of stark racism manifest in the NFL at that skill position of the quarterback, which seemed to be reserved for, for white players, and then also in the coaching sphere and so forth. I just saw that as sort of almost so glaring that I couldn't sort of continue to sort of ignore it and enjoy the game. And so I think that, I've talked to people who have played at high levels, and they've described to me some of the way in which there are these kinds of systems which almost guarantee that we have very few black players at the quarterback position, of course, and then that goes all the way back down to sort of Pop Warner decisions which are being made, in high school coaching decisions which are being made, and so it is yet another way in which we of course are not post-racial at all, but it's kind of like we have a crazy system in which certain positions are reserved for certain kinds of people, and I think that's manifest in the NFL.
Yeah. So let me ask you, this was something that Alice Green wanted me to ask you in particular, because we've been talking about it. As you know, she's been fighting this since the 60s, the civil rights era. But with the killing of George Floyd on May 25th, she said, 400 years of oppression and trying to bring these issues to the fore, everything, the whole world changed on a dime, and all of a sudden this is now taking center stage. Why do you think that particular case, and then where do we go from here? That's the next question. How long from the anger and rage and protest in the street to make some kind of deeper change?
Right. So I was really fortunate to be able to work with Alice Green when I was in Albany. And, I have, sort of consummate respect for her and people like her who have been engaged at the forefront of these kinds of issues for decades now. And, her type of leadership and her commitment to these issues is of such a different quality than that of so many who are kind of, let's say, in it for short periods of time, or not with this kind of deeper and long-lasting commitment. And so there's so much wisdom, in the ideas and thinking of someone who has been engaged for this kind of long period of time. And I think that what we have seen, right, in recent years, or in recent weeks and months and weeks, is a kind of newly awakened consciousness among many people for the first time, right? So it's a newly awakened consciousness. And what we'll be telling is how long that consciousness stays peaked, stays aware. You know what I mean? When I was in Albany, I participated in some Black Lives Matters demonstrations. I got this placard when I was back in Albany, and this was after the killing of Trayvon Martin, and then after Mike Brown and so forth. And when we were out there, there were only the most kind of radical white people were involved in these demonstrations. And then I had that same placard out over the summer, and there were not only white people sort of involved in the demonstrations, they were the organizers themselves. They were the ones who were advancing this Black Lives Matter call, right? And, you know, people were driving past one intersection where I was posted up during a demonstration, and, you know, white people had their hands, you know, raised in the air saying Black Lives Matter. And it was really a surreal, exciting, and sort of hopeful moment. I would also say that very soon after that sort of upwelling of consciousness and the great sort of hopefulness that I felt there, I began to sort of engage with the institutions where I work, attempting to really, you know, encourage leaders to bring about substantive institutional change that might impact Black students, Black professors, and sort of begin to undo some of this racist history that we are all part of. But that institutional change was a much different exercise, right? It's not, it takes so much more commitment, so much more willpower and financing than it does to stage a demonstration, right? And so I think that is where we're going to see the real sort of impact of this summer of 2020, in which a whole bunch of factors kind of coalesced to lead into this upwelling of kind of awareness and recognition. And we'll see how long that lasts, right? We'll see what it actually leads to. And I'm sure that it will lead to some changes. But if, again, you know, we're thinking about centuries and centuries of cultural and social organization that have to be reworked. And I don't think that that is going to be something that is going to sort of transpire quickly or immediately or quickly, or, you know, even in the short term. You know what I mean? I think that this is a long-term engagement, and the way that systemic racism is tied into economics and so forth is going to be is going to make this a, you know, this is a long and thorny path that we have to travel.
Yeah, and you've been doing this important work, Derik, for decades, particularly criminal justice system in the battle to fight racial injustice. So I wonder today, now that you're now in California and starting to work in California prisons, are you more optimistic today than you were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that these are going to be lasting changes, that we are starting to chip away at this 400 years of systemic racism? Or do you feel like we're just going to slip back into, you know, talk to you in 5 years and nothing will have really changed? Or do you feel this is a watershed moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. You know, how much of a watershed is this? How much of a turning point is this? I think in my own lifetime, you know, it's definitely unlike anything that I've witnessed. And yet, you know, based on what I was saying before, I think that that this is it is not as though we're at the beginning of a sort of a brand new era. I can't see that as being the reality. There are too many systems in place that ensure the perpetuation of disenfranchisement and economic abandonment and marginalization. There are too many of those interlocking systems which are sort of operating in our society to think that we're going to radically change things in the near term. I believe that this is going to be something that is going to require long-term investment and engagement at both the institutional level and the personal level. And that only as those two things go hand in hand, right, a kind of reform of thought and action on the level of each of us as individuals, but then also a real commitment to keep pressure on institutions which impact the lives of thousands and millions of people, right? That together, that sort of tandem effort will bring about a slow change, right? And of course, race, although it has this kind of you could say sort of overwhelming kind of power in the Western imagination and the American imagination, it is one of many kinds of social categories that need to be examined, right? And that we have to examine these all simultaneously. Our approach has to be holistic. You know, if we were to sort of, you know, totally sort of abolish prisons, which I believe is a necessary goal, right? We can't do that unless we also reform our education systems, our healthcare systems, our housing opportunities, right? Our policing systems, right? So all of these things have to be kind of addressed simultaneously with equal commitment. And until we begin to do that, you know, we're in a we will find ourselves replaying these same kind of dramas, perhaps in different forms, but you know, I see that happening again unless we sort of have this holistic and personal approach to the change that we want to bring on.
Right. I should have earlier on asked you about the painting behind you. So it comes to mind James Baldwin, The Fire, next time. There's something very passionate and powerful about that painting. Is there a story behind it?
Oh, well, this is just a painting of a good friend of mine. Her name is Misha Maynard, and you know, I just have been a fan of her art for a long time. And I just arranged my Zoom camera in this way, and it happened to be that this is the one that has been my backdrop for a few days now. But yeah, I mean, like, I do like the imagery and the ideas of this painting, in that, you know, it's kind of like this fire sort of burning up this individual, yet at the same time the person sort of remains, it seems, at ease in the fire. And in some ways I feel like, you know, as we sort of dismantle these, you can see the blocks over, the blocks over here, right?
Yep. Yep.
You know, as we dismantle these walls, that's going to be a kind of a fiery ordeal. These walls of kind of separation that oppress so many and that keep us apart from one another. You know, that's going to be a fiery operation. But, you know, my own thinking is that we have to sort of maintain a kind of clear-sightedness as we do that. So maybe there's some relationship between, you know, this artistic piece and my thinking about sort of social change in this moment where we're trying to address systemic racism and you know, grapple with the history that is so impinging on us all the time.
Well, we could continue, Derik, but I want to be respectful of your time. I know classes are starting, and your new work with the Africana Studies Department at Claremont McKenna College, your work in the Literature Department, and your work with the prisons. You've got a lot on your plate, but we really appreciate taking part of this symposium, The Time for Reckoning, Confronting Systemic Racism, Seeking Justice, and Reimagining Society, co-sponsored by the Center for Law and Justice, the New York State Writers Institute at the University of Albany. We miss you on UAlbany campus. I hope you'll be coming by at some point, and we really appreciate your powerful thinking, your wonderful perspective, and it's really good to see you and talk with you again, Derik.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you for, as I said before, just a few minutes. It's nice to spend time, and I really appreciate this.
Thank you. All right. So long, Derik.
See you, Paul.